This is really inspiring company to be in. I've been reading and thinking about the work of many of the people in this conference now for a while. I did want to add one more anniversary to the series of commemorations that we're thinking about in terms of this conference, and that more that were mentioned yesterday. It also happens to be the 20th anniversary of the publication of The Black Atlantic. And that's a book that That's a book that kind of changed my life, and I think probably did for a number of other people here, and really made things possible that I think were not possible before. So I'm really grateful to Paul Gilroy for that gift to us. That said, I'm also a little ungrateful for the magisterial lecture that he just gave, which I now have to follow. It's not an easy task. I also have to say that I'm not a scholar of slavery, and certainly not of the Netherlands, but really primarily a scholar of Holocaust literature and memory. But I appreciated the opportunity that was given to me here to reflect on the question of slavery in the context of memory and justice. And so my paper has a kind of exploratory nature. I hope you'll take it in that vein. And I'm thinking of it as a kind of thinking in progress. Inspired by the ambivalent commemorative context that frames this conference and which has been sketched by Esther, Françoise, and Paul, I will focus this morning on the legacy of transatlantic slavery from the perspective of cultural memory studies. My particular interest is in exploring what that legacy suggests about justice and historical responsibility today. Because I have the sense that the question of slavery's legacy has been predominantly discussed in relation to descendants of enslaved people, I want to broaden the focus to reflect also on questions of memory, justice, and responsibility in relation to those not descended from the enslaved. The hypothesis I want to pursue is that this is an ethically and politically urgent field of inquiry, but that to intervene in it, we need to develop a new category of historical responsibility that describes the implication of people in events that are temporally or spatially distant, in which they have not played or do not play a direct role as perpetrators or victims. Throughout the talk, I draw attention to the importance of the vocabulary and categories we use to address questions of responsibility. I thus begin by seeking to develop the concept of the implicated subject as a way of clarifying the ethical and political issues related to the long-term and long-distance impact of violent histories. Next, in order to assess the legacy, or legacies as I would prefer, of slavery and the slave trade, I reflect on the very word legacy along with its conceptual kin. Legacies have to be thought in the plural if we want to bring descendants and non-descendants of enslaved people into the same frame, because those legacies are asymmetrical. In a third section, I turn to a literary example, Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, in order to think further about how the category of descendant functions in the aftermath of traumatic histories. Kincaid's powerful polemic provides a visceral and affectively charged example of what implication might mean for the white subjects of the legacies and cultural memory of slavery. In a brief coda, I take inspiration from both Kincaid and Catherine Hall's Legacies of British Slave Ownership project to distinguish between two forms of implication, that which is historical and that which is structural. Whatever justice for slavery means a century and a half after abolition, it will certainly mean grappling with different forms of historical and structural implication. So part one is called Implicated Subjects. Violent histories leave legacies, and those legacies raise questions about memory, justice, and responsibility. Questions, that is, about restitution and reparation. The debates and struggles that ensue over the terms of restitution and reparation in the wake of violence frequently take place in a context structured by a discourse of victims and perpetrators. This is not surprising. After all, the need for restitution and reparation follows from an injury inflicted by one perpetrator collective on another victim collective. As Elazar Barkin writes at the beginning of The Guilt of Nations, his landmark exploration of the global dimensions of restitution, quote, "The novelty of the discourse of restitution is that it is a discussion between the perpetrators and their victims. This interaction between perpetrator and victims is a new form of political negotiation that enables the rewriting of memory and historical identities in ways that both can share," unquote. Although the discourse of restitution emerges necessarily out of a history defined by perpetrators and victims, however, that binary language of identity quickly reveals itself as inadequate. The inadequacy of the victims and perpetrators rubric is already signaled in Barkhan's description when he characterizes the horizon of successful restitution processes as involving the negotiated creation of a shared memory and history. In other words, although it draws upon those categories, restitution seeks precisely to move beyond them. Yet even putting aside this essential horizon of restitution discourse, the rubric of victims and perpetrators is more critically limited in at least two other ways as well. First, few collectives that could take part in the granting or receiving of restitution possess the homogenized membership implied by the terms victims and perpetrators. That is, the scope of restitution cases for collective historical injustice necessarily transgresses the limits of such simplified identity categories and comes to include subjects who are neither victims nor perpetrators, but still somehow caught up in the events at stake. I'm thinking, for instance, of societal participants who are not active perpetrators of human rights abuses, but who may still benefit from them in direct or indirect ways, or who may have refrained from resisting abuses when they were in a position to do so. Karl Jaspers addressed this issue in the immediate wake of the Nazi period in his reflections on forms of guilt other than criminal guilt. He developed categories that, although flawed, remain relevant. What he called political, moral, and metaphysical guilt arise in scenarios of collective violence, but cannot easily be described by the language of perpetration. At the same time, collectives that have suffered injustice may also include members situated ambiguously in relation to the traumas for which restitution is claimed. Think here of Primo Levi's important reflections on the gray zone and the problem of collaboration. Important recent work on complicity by literary critics Mark Sanders and Naomi Mandel, among others, address key aspects of these phenomena. The question of how to think about restitution in relation to complicity and collaboration is crucial for many morality and memory-based projects and cannot be adequately addressed using the categories of victim and perpetrator. In drawing attention to these gray zones of restitution, I do not mean to imply that we should halt efforts at reparation, but rather that we should try to shift such efforts to a conceptual terrain in which participation and membership might join perpetration and victimization as the salient terms. A second complication further troubles the discourse of perpetrators and victims. To the extent that a negotiated form of restitution is not achieved, and injustice persists across time, even across generations. There is a diachronic dimension to group membership that even Jaspers's broad categories do not yet address. Since the contemporary category of restitution is a recent phenomena, such a situation of unrepaired justice has been the rule for most of human history, although it was probably not generally considered in those terms. The results of this common situation are paradoxical, especially once an international norm of restitution has been established. On the one hand, in the absence of some form of negotiated justice, injustice might be said to proliferate across eras, thus creating ongoing or additional future claims for restitution. This would certainly be the case in the United States, where the abandonment of Reconstruction and the creation of subsequent forms of racial domination have propagated the injuries of slavery across the centuries. On the other hand, the future generations related genealogically to the original injustice are not easily categorized as victims and perpetrators in many cases. Even in the case of post-slavery racial injustice to which I have just alluded, I'm not sure that a discourse of victimization is the most historically accurate or politically efficacious, if only because it tends to objectify contemporary subjects and strip them of responsibility and agency in the present. Furthermore, even the language of future generations can be misleading, since many contemporary subjects facing the legacies of the past have no genealogical connection to the events. I'm thinking here especially of immigrants and their descendants. Mariana Hirsch's notion of post-memory has been influential in thinking about the transmission of trauma and memory to the children and grandchildren of victims of historical injustice, and more broadly, to future generations. But the relation between post-memory and claims of justice remains underexplored, and no one, I believe, would describe the post-memory generation as a victim generation. While some scholars, including Erin McLaughlin, have brought the post-memory generation together with the second generation of perpetrator collectives, and others, including Gabriela Schwab, have focused on the haunting legacies of perpetration for children and grandchildren, the question of responsibility and restitution on the side of the descendants of perpetrators also remains a knotty and controversial problem. In popular discourse, that problem manifests itself in resentments, for instance among young Germans, about being held responsible for events that preceded one's own birth, even though it is difficult to imagine that any thoughtful person would call perpetrators' descendants perpetrators. I've been inspired by the important work I've just mentioned on complicity, post-memory, and the haunting legacies of injustice, but I want to argue that we need a new category for describing subjects of justice and restitution that supplements the victim-perpetrator binary. I call this figure of responsibility the implicated subject. Such a category includes forms of participation in and relation to injustice that are indirect and covers axes of both spatial and temporal distance from traumatic events. In other words, the implicated subject serves as an umbrella concept that incorporates both modes of complicity, i.e., how we are implicated in injustices unfolding in the present tense, such as those described in Kevin Bales's work or the drones that Paul mentioned a moment ago, and modes of transgenerational transmission, i.e., how we are implicated in past injustices that we could not have lived through as mature, responsible subjects. Although it's crucial to maintain distinctions within this category, hence the need to think about implicated subjects in the plural, it still makes sense to posit an overarching category. An overarching category not only helps us to distinguish negatively a set of problems that do not fit into the dominant victim-perpetrator framework, but also helps us mark positively the fact that the different axes of implication, spatial and temporal, frequently overlap and intersect, albeit often in contradictory ways. In order to avoid falling back into a victim-perpetrator dichotomy, I also find it crucial to leave the scope of implicated subject positions provisionally open. That is, while descendants of perpetrators may always be implicated subjects in my terms, so might some descendants of victims, especially when they end up living under radically different socio-political circumstances. And I'm thinking here, for example, of second and third generation post-Holocaust Israelis serving, say, in the occupied territories. Our topic today is restitution for and remembrance of transatlantic slavery and former slave trading and slave-owning societies, and I will turn definitively to that context in a moment. But the questions raised by the legacies of slavery are part of a broader set of concerns about what the philosopher Jana Thompson has called diachronic justice. That is, approaches that presume that past injustices matter morally and politically, and that justice cannot be reduced to questions of present-day equity. In other related work, I've been exploring further diachronic dilemmas of remembrance and justice, including, this is the project that Gloria mentioned, the mnemonic practices of racially marked Turkish-German immigrants grappling with the legacies of National Socialism, the art and activism of diasporic Jewish intellectuals struggling to address both the Holocaust and the occupation of Palestine, and the work of the Jewish South African artist William Kentridge, which confronts both the legacies of apartheid and the histories of the Holocaust, colonialism, and indeed slavery. In all of these cases, forms of what Paul Gilroy calls translocal solidarity are constructed precisely through confrontation with one's own implication in, quote, the corrosive power of the broken world's racial order, unquote. The aftermath of Atlantic slavery provides a particularly charged terrain for reflecting on the question of restitution and memory because it possesses two characteristics seemingly at odds with each other. Significant temporal distance, since the end of the slave trade and the emancipation of slaves in Europe and the Americas took place across the 19th century and no living witnesses remain, and undeniable, yet sometimes inscrutable legacies that mark former slaveholding and slave trading societies across that distance, since questions of race, unfreedom, and property remain unavoidable nodes of social stratification, producing both advantage and disadvantage. Perhaps slavery's uncanny presence in contemporary North Atlantic societies derives from this double temporality that combines distance and constant renewal, not to mention new and ongoing forms of enslavement and exploitation. In order to begin addressing this context, I want to ask, what is a legacy? So this is part 2, called Paradoxical Legacies. To speak of the legacies of slavery is to enter into a tightly bound knot of concepts, as the Oxford English Dictionary helps us understand. Indeed, some of the problems involved in confronting the after effects of slavery are already present in the words we use to assess those after effects. The English word legacy is derived from the Latin legatus and the past participle of legare, meaning to send as a deputy or to bequeath. The first meaning of the word establishes a link to the problematic of representation in the political sense. A legate is a representative, delegate, or stand-in. This now mostly obsolete usage of the word is relevant to my analysis since it suggests a connection between legacy and implication. Implicated subjects are in certain ways stand-ins for the perpetrators to whom some degree of responsibility has been delegated. The link between legacy and slavery is even more salient in the contemporary meaning of legacy, which involves, like slavery itself, the question of property. A legacy is a sum of money or a specified article given to another by will, as well as a more generalized bequest, anything handed down by an ancestor or predecessor. A legacy is then an inheritance, a concept that brings along its own semantic field involving property, right, privilege, rank, and title, as well as a notion of natural descent. Those who inherit legacies are descendants, and what they inherit are either the legacies of property, privilege, and right, or the negation of those legacies. The concepts of legacy, inheritance, and descent seem to promise direct lines of connection between past and present. A descendant, after all, is, according to the OED, one who descends or who is descended from an ancestor, issue, offspring, in any degree, near or remote, unquote. In the dictionary definition of a descendant, degree of relation and distance between ancestor and descendant makes no difference. But in practice, the process of inheritance across generations rarely proceeds so smoothly. Not only are legacies and inheritances frequently contested at the level of the family, but at the level of society, matters of descent are even more complex. Social legacies are never transmitted as clearly or cleanly as the OED suggests, that is, through the simple handing down by an ancestor. Everyday forms of social change, such as the demographic transformations catalyzed by migration, proliferate ambiguously situated, implicated subjects. In the wake of trauma in general and slavery in particular, questions of familial and social inheritance become especially fraught. Treating people as property, chattel slavery produces morally tainted legacies of wealth for some, at the same time that it strips other classes of people of property, privilege, and right. In Slavery and Social Death, Orlando Patterson conceptualizes what he calls natal alienation as a constituent element of the slave relation. Natal alienation describes the fact that slavery sought to turn the enslaved person into a genealogical isolate who is socially dead. Quote, not only was the slave denied all claims on and obligations to his parents and living blood relations, but by extension, all such claims and obligations on his more remote ancestors and on his descendants. Formally isolated in his social relations with those who lived, he was also culturally isolated from the social heritage of his ancestors, unquote. While we know that enslaved people and their descendants have always struggled against this logic of depropriation and have recreated forms of kinship in defiance of it, Patterson's insight nonetheless helps us to think through one of the paradoxes of our topic. From the perspective of enslaved people, the legacies of slavery involve the impossibility of legacies, the attempted prevention of social inheritance through the enforcement of a radical racialized notion of biological inheritance or natural descent. This is the bifurcated legacy of slavery for descendants of the enslaved, the inheritance of a blocked inheritance. That paradoxical legacy manifests itself today in the persistent salience of race as a determining social category, one that continues to distribute property, privilege, and right in radically unequal terms. This paradoxical situation has led to distinct strategies among those who forced to confront the ongoing effects of this past. On the one hand, many members of the African diaspora have emphasized the continuities between the period of slavery and the post-slavery present, and have created movements meant to secure some kind of redress in the form of reparations, apologies, or restitution. In the words of Marcus Garvey, quote, "We are the descendants of men and women who suffered in this country for 250 years under the barbarous, the brutal institution known as slavery. Yet you who have not lost trace of your history will recall the fact that over 300 years ago, your forebears were taken from the continent of Africa and brought here for the purposes of using them as slaves," unquote. Embracing the position of descendant, Garvey asserts a strong mnemonic link both to slavery and to the pre-slavery geography of Africa, a move that had clear implications for the political movement he mobilized. At the cultural level, this perspective has led to works of art and literature, Toni Morrison's Beloved is exemplary, that depicts slavery in a haunting present tense that lives on beyond its apparent death and continues to interpolate diasporic subjects. On the other hand, some members of the African diaspora have sought to evade the paradoxical and negative inheritance of slavery through the assertion of a break with the past. The sociologist Ron Eierman calls this the progressive narrative and cites a telling 1928 passage from the American writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston. Quote, "Someone is always at my elbow reminding me that I am a granddaughter of slaves. Slavery is 60 years past. The operation was successful, and the patient is doing well, thank you." In the light of the dire conditions in which many black people live in the US today, a situation the legal scholar Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, it may be difficult to maintain Hurston's optimistic assessment of such an operation. Nevertheless, new versions of the discontinuity thesis have continued to emerge, even as they jettison the progressive narrative. In a 2012 essay called "On Failing to Make the Past Present," the Berkeley-based critic Stephen Best writes explicitly against the melancholic historicism he associates with Beloved and finds widespread in contemporary African-American intellectual culture. Instead of seeking explanations for contemporary problems in the mirror of slavery, he proposes to think about the black political present from the perspective of the radical alterity of the past. Turning to Morrison's 2008 novel, A Mercy, Best finds a historical model that differs greatly from that of Ghostly Haunting. Quote, "Where Beloved calls us back to witness in the mode of melancholic historicism, A Mercy abandons us to a more baffled, cut off, foreclosed position with regard to the slave past," unquote. In this more recent work by Morrison, writes Best, abandonment takes the place of haunting, and, quote, "throws into question the idea that the slave past provides a ready prism through which to apprehend and understand the black political present by refusing to make the slave past the progenitor of the existential condition of black people or of black people alone." Morrison invites us to think about what it means to be held in the grip of slavery, but not of race, unquote. Best does not by any means argue that we have reached the end of racism, but rather suggests that, quote, "the logic of racial slavery does not fully describe or capture racial injustice in the present," unquote. I can understand the value of Best's provocation as a challenge to thinking about the black political present. But what about the political present of non-African diaspora subjects, people who, for the most part, have been happy to abandon the slave past to oblivion? Best's critique of claims to continuity with slavery's past makes for a productive juxtaposition with historian Nicholas Draper's 2010 book, The Price of Emancipation, and Catherine Hall and her colleagues' project, Legacies of British Slave Ownership, which, contrary to Best, do seek to trace potential lines of connection out of the past. An obvious and crucial difference between the object of Best's critique and the project of Hall and Draper, however, is that while Best focuses on the legacies of enslavement, Hall and Draper focus, of course, on the legacies of slave ownership. Yet the Hall-Draper project also does not operate in the mode of melancholic historicism and ghostly haunting to which Best objects. Rather, by attending to the financial compensation of slave owners that took place in Britain at the moment of slavery's abolition, their project seeks to make visible the material chains of transmission that connect profits from slavery to Britain's slavery era and post-abolition economy, politics, and culture. Perhaps a further potential moment of connection exists in Best's hesitant assertion that the shift from continuity to abandonment, quote, refuses to make the slave past the progenitor of the existential condition of black people or of black people alone. I want to emphasize that. That last qualification suggests that what it means to be held in the grip of slavery but not of race will have implications for people across racial categories, and in particular for those who have inherited the cultural capital of whiteness, if not financial capital itself, from the slave owners and their heirs. A project on slave ownership and its aftermath helps us to think of slavery's legacies as not just about black people alone, a possibility that seems of most urgent contemporary political importance to me. Hall and Draper make available an archive for thinking empirically about the production of implicated subjects through the transmission of actual inheritances. As Draper writes, the slave system, quote, was an economic system that continuously recruited new participants in the metropole through inheritance and legacies. Almost invariably, those recruits retained rather than renounced their inheritance, unquote. As this process of recruitment through inheritance and legacies took place, slavery was, paradoxically, both diffused through British society and rendered more intimate. According to Draper, quote, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 did not end Britain's intimate relationship with slavery. Slave ownership had been converted into financial property and conveyed between generations and sexes by the full range of available techniques of management and control governing other types of property, unquote. After the compensation program of the 1830s and the end of slavery in the British Empire, this process of conversion of property and human beings to other forms of capital continued. It continued through the use of that capital to generate surplus from wage laborers and financial markets, with obvious but uncertain implications for tracking slavery's ongoing legacies in the metropole. The simultaneity of diffusion and intimacy that Draper and the Legacies project reveal can inspire reflection that moves beyond the immediate aftermath of emancipation and also beyond the empirical transmission of slave-owning legacies. Their project can thus help us address the central dilemma of implicated subjects in this context. What does it mean to inherit the legacies of slavery across vast distances of time, or when you are not a descendant of those who were enslaved? I now shift gears and reflect on the legacies of transatlantic slavery for implicated subjects through a close reading of a literary text, Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place. Rather than attempting to settle definitively the conundrum of how to think restitution for slavery, I want to show how select passages in Kincaid's work make claims on white readers by refusing to settle, and instead taking them, us, directly into the moral and temporal confusions wrought by the histories of slavery and colonialism and their paradoxical legacies. In provocative and sometimes disturbing ways, Kincaid reveals, like Draper, the diffusion and intimacy of slavery's legacies in a globalized world. Part 3 is called Just Human Beings. At the end of A Small Place, a generically hybrid, non-fictional work from 1988, Kincaid's narrator provides a condensed and provocative historical account of her homeland, Antigua. Generally and correctly read as a vitriolic indictment of tourism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, and post-colonial corruption, A Small Place is also a reflection on the legacies of slavery in a nation that was a significant site of slave-based sugar cultivation starting in the 17th century. In the final paragraph of the text, Kincaid both reiterates many of the motifs that constitute the argument of A Small Place and seems radically to undo the very terms of that argument. I'm going to now read the full final paragraph. Again, Antigua is a small place, a small island. It is 9 miles wide by 12 miles long. It was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1493. Not too long after, it was settled by human rubbish from Europe, who used enslaved but noble and exalted human beings from Africa. All masters of every stripe are rubbish, and all slaves of every stripe are noble and exalted. There can be no question about this. To satisfy their desire for wealth and power, to feel better about their own miserable existence, so that they could be less lonely and empty, a European disease. Eventually, the masters left in a kind of way. Eventually, the slaves were freed in a kind of way. The people in Antigua now, the people who really think of themselves as Antiguans, and the people who would immediately come to your mind when you think about what Antiguans might be like, I mean, supposing you were to think about it, are the descendants of those noble and exalted people, the slaves. Of course, the whole thing is, once you cease to be a master, once you throw off your master's yoke, you are no longer human rubbish. You are just a human being, and all the things that adds up to. So too with the slaves. Once they are no longer slaves, once they are free, they are no longer noble and exalted. They are just human beings. That's the end of the book. Like the entire text of A Small Place and much of Kincaid's other work, this passage is characterized by deliberately hyperbolic claims, abrupt shifts in voice and address, and parenthetical reflections that disrupt the linear movement of the discourse. While the first two sentences mimic a European colonial narrative of discovery and its consequent rhetoric of condescension, Kincaid then quickly turns the tables and provides a morally polarized counter-discourse that condemns the colonizer while idealizing the enslaved. Next, the invocation of the ambivalences of emancipation and decolonization, which the narrator deliberately conflates, partially displaces the discourse of colonialism and anti-colonialism. Eventually, the masters left in a kind of way. Eventually, the slaves were freed in a kind of way. By describing decolonization as an experience of masters and slaves, Kincaid makes slavery the master code for understanding colonialism and its continuation, in a kind of way, into the era of formal independence. In the passage's subsequent approach to the post-emancipation, post-independence moment, however, a further and final reversal occurs. The anti-colonial counter-discourse of rubbish and nobility gives way to an apparent leveling in which both former slaves and former masters are redefined. Now they are just human beings. In concluding A Small Place with this series of reversals and displacements, Kincaid also situates the entire text in relation to a question about implicated subject positions that is never explicitly posed. What does it mean to be a descendant of slavery? This question addresses both those called here the descendants of those noble and exalted people, the slaves, and those who would be the descendants of human rubbish, the masters. Through the text's most evident rhetorical techniques, the expression of unbridled rage and the direct address to a reader explicitly evoked as a white European or North American tourist, Kincaid aggressively situates her audience among the descendants of human rubbish while locating herself among the descendants of slaves. Indeed, throughout A Small Place, the rhetoric of address serves as a powerful means of making implication in the racialized legacies of slavery a palpable experience for readers. This mode of address continues into the text's last paragraph, where the implied, or better implicated, white reader is imputed to have only a thoughtlessly casual relation to the existence of Antiguans. But here the text's structure of address is unsettled, if not undermined, by Kincaid's final rhetorical twist. Okay, thanks. The suggestion that, the suggestion that perhaps dissent is an inadequate explanation for the sources of subjectivity in a post-colonial, post-slavery world. How can we make sense of these twists and turns, and what do they tell us about the question of being a descendant implicated in the legacies of slavery? The contradictory ending of A Small Place evokes the force of a double bind in confronting slavery's legacies. Either one foregrounds a particularistic identity premised on the I, we versus you distinction of the text's mode of address, the victim-perpetrator discourse, or one moves in the direction of a universalizing liberal humanism, we're all just human beings. As instances of a much broader dilemma concerning how to confront stigmatized identities, neither of these options seems satisfactory. The particularistic version, because it risks reproducing what Wendy Brown has called wounded attachments that reify subordinate subject positions. The universalistic version, because it risks foreshortening history and thus prematurely foreclosing claims for justice made on behalf of legacies of suffering. Kincaid, however, refuses the blackmail of the double bind, which also echoes the contrast between the continuity and abandonment perspectives I discussed earlier. Instead of choosing a side or seeking the articulation of a moderate middle ground, Kincaid's solution is to present both sides in equally overstated terms. Drawing on the resources of literature, which need not obey the logic of non-contradiction, as must normative discourses of law or philosophy, this rhetorical strategy has the advantage of situating all descendants of slavery on the same moral plane, while still demanding awareness of an unexpiated crime. The paradoxes of that reading of the text's conclusion can be supplemented by a further move. An alternative interpretation opens up if one emphasizes Kincaid's description of emancipation from both slavery and colonialism as having taken place eventually in a kind of way. The temporal and notional vagueness of Kincaid's phrasing here suggests that the final turn toward just human beings may describe not an achieved actuality, but a future possibility, that horizon beyond victims and perpetrators towards which restitution discourse also gestures. Once the masters truly throw off the master's yoke, they will no longer be human rubbish, the narrator claims, but she supplies no evidence that such a divestment has actually taken place. Rather, she presents readers with a process of neo-colonial surrogation that has ensured a quasi-continuous chain of mastery from the British colonizers to US hegemony and foreign, primarily Syrian and Lebanese capital, which dominate post-independence Antiguan politics and economy, together with corrupt local politicians. As the text's focus on corruption suggests, the human rubbish of perpetration persists even as the descendants of slaves are no longer easily categorizable as mythic victims, as noble and exalted human beings from Africa. An asymmetry has set in. The era of decolonization contains neither the clear-cut distinctions of the age of slavery and colonialism, nor the erasure of race and class distinctions that a true emancipation would promise. Instead, A Small Place suggests the histories of slavery and colonialism have produced a proliferation of rubbish that continues to characterize the actions of the powerful, but also contaminates the relatively powerless. In the shifts, contradictions, and provocations of A Small Place, I want to locate both a dilemma and a possible step forward. The dilemma involves recognizing the disparate demands that histories of slavery and colonialism continue to make on individuals and societies even after formal emancipation. The persistence of tainted inheritances and legacies, as well as the need to break the logic of natural descent that stands behind such inheritances. The step forward involves Kincaid's contribution to theorizing a new kind of responsible subject out of the rubbish of the post-slavery moment. The conceptualization of what I have called the implicated subject is a way of naming that in-between space evoked by Kincaid that is not adequately described by either the universalist shedding of difficult pasts or the maintenance of violence-determined subject positions inherited wholesale from history. Additionally, in blurring the difference between slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, Kincaid also blurs the relation between the temporal and spatial axes of implication, between the legacies of the past and the unequal relations of the present. While such a strategy provocatively jettisons claims to historical specificity at a price that one must still consider, it also allows us insight into cases such as slavery in which the originary protagonists are no longer present, even as their impact lives on, and cases such as capitalist globalization, in which the chain of what Paul Ricoeur calls imputability between agents and outcomes is rendered unimaginably complex. Kincaid does not take for granted or abstractly theorize implicated white subjects. Rather, she produces them rhetorically through a mode of address that sometimes elicits an uncanny degree of embodied affect. In a famous passage, Kincaid offers a vivid suggestion of what it might feel like to be an implicated subject caught between the currents of the past and the present. Early on, the narrator interrupts the white tourist's Caribbean idyll by speculating on the passage of human waste from the hotel toilet into the sea. Quote, "You must not wonder what exactly happened to the contents of your lavatory when you flushed it. Oh, it might all end up in the water you were thinking of taking a swim in. The contents of your lavatory might, just might, graze gently against your ankle as you wade carefree in the water. But the Caribbean Sea is very big and the Atlantic Ocean is even bigger. It would amaze you to know the number of black slaves this ocean has swallowed up." This passage not only confirms the sense of a society literally awash with refuse, but also produces a bodily frisson of implication in a present defined by neocolonial relations and ecological disaster. Yet Kincaid also goes a step further in linking this pollution to the history of slavery and thus to the questions of diachronic justice. In evoking the vastness of the Atlantic, Kincaid pretends at first to minimize white subjects' implication in the dirt of the present, but instead ends up immersing them in further historical contamination. The graze of the ankle marks an intimate encounter between contemporary freedom, the tourist's carefree waiting, and the waste of unfreedom, past, present, and future. In moments like this, a small place charts the polluted terrain of memory and the diffused but intimate legacies of slavery beyond the certainties of victims and perpetrators. Let me now conclude briefly with a connection, a distinction, and an unanswered question. I hope I can do this. There's at least one place where the legacies of British slave ownership project and a small place intersect. In a particularly bitter passage, Kincaid recounts how a predatory and corrupt foreign capitalist has outbid the government of Antigua and bought the papers of the island's most historically significant slave owners, the Codrington family, who owned thousands of slaves from the 17th century until emancipation and held onto a sugar plantation until well into the 20th century. The foreigner's plan, according to Kincaid, is to donate the Codrington papers back to the government so that they can be held in the museum and library he plans to build for Antigua. The Codrington family papers are obviously an important source for a project like Legacies of British Slave Ownership, and sure enough, one Christopher Bethel Codrington figures in the project's database as a major recipient of compensation. In 1835, Bethel Codrington was awarded £30,000 for 8 separate claims regarding the 1,916 human beings that he owned as slaves at the moment of emancipation. Kincaid asks despairingly, "And what does it mean, the records of one set of enemies bought by another enemy, given to the people who have been their victims as a gift?" The juxtaposition of Bethel Codrington's Legacies entry and the fate of the Codrington family papers recounted by Kincaid illustrates the complementary contributions history and literature can make to thinking about the legacies of slavery. It also suggests to me the need to distinguish between two kinds of implicated subjects in relation to transatlantic slavery: those who are historically implicated and those who are structurally implicated. In cases of historical implication, we can trace particular lines of transmission of the sort made available by the Legacies project. For instance, one can easily find detailed versions of the Codrington family tree in online genealogies that allow us to identify particular living individuals related to this family of slave owners. Those descendants are historically implicated subjects of transatlantic slavery. Kincaid's foreigner, in contrast, stands in for those of us with a non-genealogical relation to slavery who nevertheless find ourselves entwined in its aftermath, either because of our racial privilege, our diffuse but intimate financial interests, our migration into post-slavery situations, or because we too, as scholars, trade in the archives of slavery. We are, like the foreigner, structurally implicated subjects, and our implication concerns the deeds and relations of both past and present. Structural implication implies that we are part of a system in which the legacies of slavery still matter, even if no continuous lines of transmission link us to that past. I conclude then with a question which is both urgent and unanswerable. As historically or structurally implicated subjects, what debt do we owe to justice? Thanks for your patience.
I realize as I start, I'm the one thing standing between you and lunch, so I'll try and be as brief as possible in my remarks, and try and just draw out some of what I think are the broader implications of Michael's analysis of this question of responsibility. And I do so by going back to Esther Captain's opening remarks yesterday, when she drew attention to the fact that funding is being withdrawn from many cultural institutions in the Netherlands, and that colonial institutions in particular seem to be, or post-colonial institutions seem particularly affected. The Moluccan Museum here in Utrecht has been closed. The National Institute for the Study of Slavery is threatened with financial closure, and the Tropen Museum will survive, but in severely curtailed form. We heard this yesterday. And these are certainly very serious and very worrying developments, especially for those whose livelihoods are directly at stake. But I'd nevertheless like to propose that we just don't take for granted that there should always be separate institutions for archiving and curating the memories of minority groups within Holland. In the long term, having separate institutions, memory institutions for particular groups, has a downside. Relegation to the status of the supplement, relegation to the status of satellites in the form of sort of memory reservations designed to capture but also to contain alternative narratives. Whereas what we've been seeing, I think, in the last 24 hours is the realization that how profoundly embedded, how profoundly central the experience and the activities of colonialism is to any Dutch narrative. So it seems to me that the real issue is not so much how these particular institutions will survive, but how we see the future of these entangled histories which Catherine Hall and Geert Oostindia brought out so clearly yesterday, giving us ample historical evidence based on data for the possibility for producing new sorts of narratives, and Paul Gilroy has added in other possibilities this morning. So it seems to me the real challenge is not even just how do we produce these alternative narratives, but how do these narratives enter into the public sphere? How do they enter into what we might call memory culture? Reference was referred to yesterday to sort of pathologies of memory. So we have this work going on in the historiographical field of uncovering new narratives, but we have a certain disjunction between those new narratives and, as it were, public culture, including the newly restored Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which was the beneficiary of much new investment and will undoubtedly be the source of much new income. So it seems to me what we have to think about now is how we develop new sorts of notions of public memory and memory practices which go beyond those sort of pathologies we talked about yesterday, and which, in my view, should go beyond the sort of identitarian policies and politics on which the establishment of discrete institutions of memory were based, and indeed on which the institution of such an institution as the Rijksmuseum is itself based, being seen as a primary source and platform for the production of Dutch identity. But I think we need to go beyond these questions of identity and its relation to memory to see if we can develop new ways of engaging publicly with the past in ways which lead to different sorts of the transformation of social relations and not merely the reproduction of reified subject positions. And this is where I see that Michael Rothberg's paper has really something very, very important to offer us. It's beginning to help us to conceptualize alternative modes of thinking about the relationship between memory as a cultural practice in the present and its possible potential for affecting social relations. And I think he does so along many, many lines, but I'm just going to concentrate on two of them here. His rethinking of the relationship between past and present along the concept of legacy, and secondly, his idea of the implicated subject. Let me see if I get some water here. Thank you. So I think, to begin with the question of his rethinking of the idea of legacy, in my view, a lot of the problems with present-day cultures of commemoration is in the sense that the expectations are so high. There's a sense certainly on the part of those delivering apology and reparation, that this will close off the past, this will pastify the past, to use an expression that was brought up yesterday. Whereas there's an asymmetry in these processes of reconciliation, which often lead to a sense of these gestures always falling short. Now, one of the reasons why they fall short, in my view, is that they are not linked into present-day inequalities. And in a certain sense, the discourse of memory itself is cutting off that possibility. Whereas the idea of legacy, as developed by Michael Rothberg, is beginning to allow us to think in different ways about the relationship between the past and present. Legacy not as heritage, not as a fixed sort of object that's like your grandmother's ring, which is passed on from one generation to another, but rather as something which is about different forms of articulation between different groups, between different positions, between different moments in the past, but also between different locations, different sites in the present. So this idea of legacy as something which is dynamic, which is part of a process of transmission and a process of transformation, I think is extremely important, especially when it is linked, as in Michael's talk, to the question of responsibility. Responsibility, which is about being in the present. Thomas Carlyle, who wrote pretty awful things about colonialism, as we heard yesterday, actually wrote some very interesting things about history and the philosophy of history. And one of the things that he talked about was, he said that history is about, he compared to a letter which is passed from one generation to another, but which is indecipherable. And in talking about this idea of an indecipherable or difficult to decipher letter, it's talking about a legacy as something which needs to be read and which needs to be constituted in the present. Another way of looking at this might be to call on Jacques Derrida's discussion of the spectres of Marx, where he talks about a haunting legacy, a legacy which is haunting us in the form of an exhortation to do something. In that sense, these are not just objects, but legacies which carry a commitment and an exhortation with them, and which are linked to the idea of being a beneficiary in the present. So not being related to the past, to different forms of path dependencies on the relationship of continuity and identity, but on the relationship of this idea of being a beneficiary in terms of property, but also in terms of cultural capital. So I think this idea of legacy is an extremely important one for allowing us to think in more differentiated ways about the double temporality Michael refers to in this relationship between past, present, and therefore it's also its relationship to the future. So that's, I think, one line of a very important contribution of this paper. The second one has to do with the question of memory and identity. I'm caricaturing here a bit, but I think it's true to say that by and large, memory and identity, as it has been so central to citizenship certainly since the 19th century, has generally been conceived of in fairly linear ways, and particularly in relation to these sort of collective groups which are considered to be to persist across time. So by and large, we've had this idea that individuals belong to particular groups which have this continuous identity across time, and to which individuals are affiliated in some almost quasi-biological sense, and Michael refers to this idea of this discourse of natural descent, which is extremely important, especially when it comes to issues of race, but at the same time, it's one which I think needs to be scrutinized when it comes to other forms of identity construction. By the way, this idea of a sort of biological connection and how it delimits and is implicit in a lot of our discussions of collective identity came out a number of years ago, along with the discussion about how should migrants, Dutch migrant citizens or Moroccan Dutch citizens, how should they be somehow included in the commemoration of the Second World War, which is so central to the Dutch narrative. One of the solutions was, well, why not draw attention to the fact that there were Moroccan soldiers fighting on the side of the Allies and who have been buried in Zeeland. There's something to be said for this sort of connection, but behind it is the idea that the only way to connect to a common history of which you are and to a collectivity of which you are part is somehow through this type of natural descent. As we know through various works on, as other cases of immigration shows, individuals and groups can change roles. They can change sides, and I think this is the question that's brought out very clearly in Michael's paper, the idea that if we look at in more detail at the course of history, we see that individuals and groups can change sides, occupy different positions, they can change positions. I'm thinking here of the Scots and the Irish who start, as it were, or conceived of as in victim position in relation to internal colonialism on the British Isles, and nevertheless have been shown through historical research to be very active parties in the imperial project elsewhere. And I think this idea of shifting away from this identity notion of engagement to the idea of implicated subjects allows us to move in, to take into account these different types of entangled genealogies, these types of the capacity of people to become different. And this becoming implicated subjects is starting the discussion from the present and the relationship between this historical justice and this and injustice, and on the one hand, on the other side, the implication, the complicity in present-day arrangements. So if one, in a sense, is serious about recognizing historical injustice, one, by being as an implicated subject, must be also serious about present-day injustice. And I think this is a very important way, therefore, of bringing together, through this idea of the implicated subject, different types of connectedness in terms of a responsibility in the present, rather than a comfortable position of this was my past and the past was fine, or not. So far, so very good, I would say, in Michael's presentation. So I just like finally to draw him out on three different issues, because I think his idea of legacy, the implicated subject, brings us very far, but it doesn't quite go far enough, and I would love to draw him out on three different issues. The first one has to do with this idea of the implicated subject in relation to what you call the just human beings, the idea of the human as the horizon. I think it's extremely important and very productive to start this discussion about memory from the embodied acting singular subject, whose story can generate these sort of complexities we're interested in capturing. At the same time, there seems to be a big gap between your implicated subject and the framework of the just human. So I'd be interested in hearing more about what's the space between that implicated subject and the horizon of humanity in terms of the categories which we have been accustomed to use of group identity, of being perpetrator-victim, of belonging to a certain nation, a certain collectivity, or a certain race. Do these disappear from the analysis? I would suggest they don't, and I would like to hear how you would put them into it. The second point has to do with the modes of implication, or the modes of engagement. It seems to me that your discussion comes very much out of the question of perpetratorship, and that is extremely important. But the result is that implication, the implicated subject, is is carrying a responsibility in terms of guilt. I would be interested in hearing more about different sorts of implications which may have to do with connectedness, solidarity, identification with, rather than just this notion of being having a bad conscience. The third point has to do with the question, how do you conceive of this, the interpolation, as it were, of the implicated subject in the broader field? You gave a wonderful analysis of Jamaica Kincaid's, that passage of how she's working with all these different subject positions. That's one novel. How do you see that type of, how do implicated positions, subjects become aware of this fact? And I know this is a big question, but I know you're up to big challenges. How might this fit into these more general politics of and public practices of memory? Do you see a place for new types of practices which would engage this sort of implication? Thank you.
Okay, Michael is first going to address the three issues that Anne raised.
Or not. He'll try. Thanks, Anne, for the both generous but also challenging response. Let me think here. What can I say? So there's a kind of large gap as you described it that opens up. On the one side, we have this very abstract universal category that Kincaid introduces of the just human being and of humanity, right? As we know this discourse. I think the other side, I guess I see the implicated subject as precisely that figure for that gap. And the gap is more, because the implicated subject is not so much meant to describe an individual, but it's a position that I'm trying to sketch, right? And it's a position that is, of course, occupied by us as individuals, and as individuals, I suppose, that we take responsibility, but it's a space or position that is certainly defined also by different kinds of collective belonging. And that's where I think that the Jaspers, actually, his notion of political, what he calls political guilt, I would probably want to call political responsibility, is important because it's trying to get at responsibility that is precisely not individual. That's criminal guilt, right? If you've committed a crime, you're responsible in that sense, and that would be true in terms of your participation in larger histories as well. But it's what kind of responsibility do you have based on a kind of membership precisely in that case, a political collective. That's what's at stake for Jaspers, and I think that's useful for thinking about implication. I think it then becomes more difficult, though, and this is what at least I don't see him addressing it, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I've just missed it because I'm not really an expert on Jaspers ultimately, but what happens then diachronically is one question for me, right? How is membership constituted? How is political membership constituted across time? In other words, it's one thing to have been a German citizen during the period of National Socialism. It's another thing to be a German citizen today, thinking back to that legacy. And I think that, again, this is where we're precisely in that in-between gap. You can't simply say, I'm just a human being, I think, right? I'm not a German, I'm just a human being. That's a false response. And you also can't say, I'm just an individual and I wasn't even alive at that time. By virtue of a kind of membership in a collective, you enter into a zone of implication. It's not a zone of guilt, right? It's certainly not a zone of criminal guilt, but it's a zone that requires some sort of response, I suppose. And I think it demands that, and it gets more complicated, and here's the project that I'm working on together with Yasemin Yildiz, who is here, about immigrants and German memory culture. Okay, what happens then to people who are not comfortably in the position of membership today, and yet are simultaneously called on to take responsibility and told this is not your history? And what we're interested in exploring is precisely the way that people negotiate, contemporary migrants in Germany today are negotiating this double bind between being required to take responsibility and being refused the opportunity, being refused that subject position of the responsible subject. And this sort of leads in a way into your question about, I guess it was your third question about how we translate this into the wider public sphere. I mean, I use Kincaid as an example, and it's only one example, though I think it's a powerful one, of the way that cultural production can actively produce certain forms of implication. She does it there through address. And I don't have, there's no simple question to that. I mean, I think that would be, what would be interesting for me at least would be to continue thinking about what are the other cultural forms that produce a sense of implication, new understandings of responsibility in this field between an abstract humanity and a criminally guilty subject. And we do have lots of other examples of that in the realm of public culture. I think from our project on migrants in the German past, it's not really, it's something different from the topic here a little bit. But I think I would look precisely to the realm of public culture, to theater, to performance, to literature, to community organizing. We have some examples of very interesting community organizing projects where very heterogeneous groups of immigrants are engaging in very original, productive ways with that particular legacy of violence. Yeah, in terms of whether it's always about guilt or being a beneficiary, and I'd already maybe distinguished between those two categories, right? To be a beneficiary, say, of global capitalism is one kind of implication. To be the descendant of a perpetrator and therefore to seem to inherit a kind of guilt or responsibility is another kind of implication, which seems wrong to describe as being a beneficiary, but is precisely the kind of the inheritance of guilt that you talked about. Are there other more positive forms? I started from the notion that implicated subject could potentially describe both those descended from the perpetrators and also those descended from the victims. I'm not entirely sure at this point if I want to keep thinking about it in that way or sort of situate it more the question of what is the legacy of perpetration. But I think it is a realm in which that one needs to think about solidarity. I mean, that is ultimately what's at stake, is how do you construct forms of solidarity that would not simply reproduce the identity positions of the past, but would still acknowledge their force and their hold, right, which is still there. So we can't simply leave the past behind. That's obviously not what I'm asking for, but we need to work through it. I think that's the term that Paul Gilroy introduced, and which is important to our project, coming partly out of Adorno's reflections on the question of working through. Working through means both engaging with those terms from the past, but without reproducing them, without repeating them, somehow displacing them. And that can happen in acts of solidarity, I think, for sure. That's inadequate, but I'll stop.
So I'm going to go around the room and collect 3 questions, which is about all we have time for. Please say your name.
Thank you. I'm Catherine Hall. Is it working? It's not really a question, it's a comment and a thank you to you both for what you've said, which is tremendously relevant to the work that we've been doing at UCL. But I wanted to say that space of engagement, I think that we do have examples of that space of engagement in the public culture that we've been trying to develop around the project, the workshops we've been doing across the country, where the entanglement, where it is simply, it's very rare to be able to talk about simple descendants of perpetrators and simple descendants of victims, because the entanglements are so elaborate and so elaborated over the generations, so that the histories of connection are actually there, embodied in the people in the room. And of course, that's not always the case. Of course, there are families. There are families of perpetrators who are still living in the properties in Britain and who've mostly disengaged from the Caribbean, but they're still living off that, that inheritance. But for example, some of them are being very generous with family papers, not retreating into guilt and shame in a negative way, but able to see that if they will give the family papers that they have to be worked on, that is a way of making connection, of being implicated subjects. I like that. I find that terminology very helpful. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah. Oh.
So,
My name is Patricia Schor. I'm from Utrecht. I would like to give a comment and to pose a question as well. The question is to Michael Rothberg, and I suppose I am engaging with the invitation of Gloria, that is to use your very interesting contribution as a way to problematize white supremacy. And then I am referring to the dilemma that you mentioned, that is, on one hand, to recognize the continuities of this legacy. Of course, it's a legacy. And the other way is to theorize this entanglement. You talked about privilege as a way that we find ourselves, a condition that we find ourselves to live in. And I would like you to elaborate a bit on that, because from my perspective, privilege is something that has to be continuously produced and reproduced. People have to work actively to remain and to benefit from this position. My comment is to Rigney, to what you said about what I see as the demise of the knowledge infrastructure about to problematize, to think, and to analyze, to research colonialism in the Netherlands. And I don't think that we should regret that only because it's a matter of people's livelihoods, but because this, in my perspective, is a reflection of the continuities of colonialism in this country, that these institutions, they have given place to another voice which is silenced in the Dutch university, which is white and white supremacist in this sense. So I see it as a highly problematic move. Thank you.
okay. So then we go to the last person. Where's the microphone?
Oh, do I? Yeah. Okay.
Please.
Hi.
Okay,
Yes,
sorry.
Michael, thank you for that. I thought the notion of the implicated subject was really productive. I guess I want to ask you a bit about incommensurability. So the kind of incommensurability of a kind of analytic vocabulary, particularly about victim and perpetrator, which I tend to think of in terms of like Holocaust studies and thinking about that in relationship to the afterlife of slavery, and particularly around the zone of entanglement. I mean, earlier, Paul Gilroy quoted from that moment in Equiano's narrative where the person who loved him like a son, his father, then sells him, right? So it seems that particularly in terms of the case of the Atlantic slave trade, we think about these perverse lines of descent. But in terms of the issue of structural implication, I mean, I think of thinking about the legacy of slavery and the social problems that it opens up being posed as an analytic issue as early as Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, right? So I guess I wanted you to kind of also address in these different frameworks in which we pose the question of an afterlife of slavery. One might be something like a political ecology or historical sociology, and the other is a discourse of memory, and just to speak about the tensions perhaps between those frameworks as well.
I'm going to ask Anne first. Okay. Do you want to comment first?
So thank you for this remark, Patricia, because it allows me to clarify something, because if what I wanted to say in making my remark on the institutions was just to point out more a structural problem, which is about the question of how these different histories relate to each other. And I was thinking here of a comment made by Françoise Vergès yesterday morning, where she was talking about there is an issue when you've got these disconnected sort of different histories, which then risk becoming all of them marginalized. Whereas it seems to me the real problem is how you get to the integration of these histories into the main Dutch narrative, because they'll always remain otherwise these supplements. So it seems to me the real drama is about the Rijksmuseum, and its status, and how that is perceived, rather than the question of, in themselves, the importance of the institutions. Whereas I'm absolutely with you on the importance of investing and working towards bringing those stories forward. I'm just not sure that it's through the institutions themselves that is the only way forward. And so I think that's there, because there is a struggle going on for what is what stories are to be told, and how are they to be told, and where they're to be told. I absolutely agree with you on that. And that struggle continues, but the question is just, where does it take place, right?
Yeah, maybe picking up a little bit on that part of Patricia's question, but I think that gets to the other part that you were asking me about, the production and reproduction of privilege, I think. I mean, how do we stop that? You need to jam the machinery of the reproduction of privilege, obviously. And I think to go to this question of institutions, I would say, and I think this is where Anne was going in her last comment, but maybe even draw that out a little bit more, I think you need dual tracks, right? I think you need to make a claim on the common, but you also need alternative and autonomous zones for, developing critiques, which don't have to be identity-based. Again, I know the German scene better than the Dutch scene, certainly, and one of the theaters that we've been doing a lot of work in describes itself as a post-migrant theater, and it's also very post-ethnic in a way, and it's offering, it's not the Deutsches Theater, right? It's not the grand canonical theater, though it's important to, storm those gates as well. But it's also important to have this space in Kreuzberg where people are coming together across identity categories and producing alternative kinds of work that are putting into question the canonical institutions at another level, I think. In terms of the continuity of legacy that you mentioned, also, I'm still with Patrizia here for a second. One thing that strikes me, I think one thing that's interesting and difficult about this material, as I understand it so far, is that yes, in a certain sense, the legacy is continuous, but the subjects who occupy that position of privilege are discontinuous, and that's when you start to bring in the histories of immigration and the changes of generations, and I think it's precisely bringing to what's I think both difficult but also crucial is how you bring together this kind of structural position of privilege and a kind of changing demographic that comes to occupy that position, which is shifting and never quite as neat as it sometimes it looks like from outside, perhaps, or at another more abstract level. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that was my first response to your question. I wanted to go back to Catherine's comment, and of course, actually, the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project would be precisely one of those public projects that would be, that obviously I took as doing the work of producing some sort of sense of implication, so I wanted to just emphasize that again. I'm really fascinated by this Codrington case and had a little bit more that I wanted to do with that. I certainly want to keep looking into that and trying to use your project and bring it together with this literary analysis. One thing I noticed when I was looking into it was there was a BBC film shown short BBC film shown in the context of the 2007 commemorations called From Codrington to Codrington, which was trying to link a village in, I don't know, Gloucestershire or something to a village on the island of Barbuda. Antigua and Barbuda are the two islands, is the island nation, both named after this same family of slave owners. And one thing that struck me in watching that, those connections that were made is they never at all brought up the family. The family, as it continues to exist, was completely absent. And I agree with what you said yesterday. This isn't about naming and shaming, but you also would hope that there could be, what we want would be self-reflection and self-criticism on the part of, I think, those families that still exist and whose traces still exist in the landscapes, both in Britain and in the Caribbean. So I thought that was an interesting moment. Okay, sorry. Saidiya's questions are difficult ones. Zone of incommensurability, yes, in terms of victim and perpetrator, but even in terms of the Holocaust, that's why someone like Levy is important, right? Because it's also a zone of intersection, right? The gray zone is also one where the incommensurability starts to fracture a little bit. And the story about Equiano interestingly echoes a story that I just read in an essay by Hassan Haag about the essay is really about Australia, but he mentions the case of Eichmann's son, where there's a similar thing where there's both a loving relationship of the father and a sense of, obviously, of historical guilt, which he describes then as pollution, a sense of pollution. And Haag reads that the sense of pollution is coming precisely from the fact that the relationship to the parent was a relationship of love and of some sort of positive transmission that was then mixed in with the negative inheritance. That's just a kind of a free association. I think I need to finish up, so I haven't answered your question, I realize that.
Okay, I want to thank all of you for your active listening and participating, and of course Anne and Michael for a very rich panel.